3 weeks, 3 videos. Damn. Today I want to go a little bit differently and not talk so much about sciences, just the tragedy that is the fitness industry, by addressing the issue of broscience and talking about who the real bro scientists are. It's fairly safe to say that for the grand majority of the time people have been training intensely, it was not particularly science-based. In the U.S., at least not in the U.S. In the U.S., I would say, the whole strength training thing, which came out of health faddism, started after the war when people had enough money to do such things and weren't concerned mainly with survival. And at that time, it was a lot of trial and error. People would lift heavy weights and do gymnastics and hand balancing. It was part of an overall health culture. It was probably different in European countries. Like the Germans were doing research on isometrics, Hettinger and Mueller, fairly early. And of course, the Germans would apply tons of science to their drug protocols when they came to nomin's in the late 70s and early 80s. But I'm still sticking with kind of the before that time. And when the Russians entered the game for the Olympics, they did a lot of research into, optimizing biomechanics for Olympic lifting and things of that nature. But by and large, in America, there wasn't much of it. And what was kind of silly. Research Quarterly published some amazing stuff back in the day. Exercise sciences that existed mostly studied aerobic training. Weight training was still thought of as, makes you slow, makes you muscle bound, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be a while before the earliest studies came about, and even those were mostly focused on strength. I can't honestly say exactly when the first studies on hypertrophy and bodybuilding muscle growth really started, at least in humans. It's probably somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s. I think the technology was starting to become available, but also it was becoming a little bit more interesting because bodybuilding had finally become a little bit legitimized because of Arnold. Prior to that, the idea of putting on a bathing suit and oiling yourself up to prance about on stage was looked down a little bit, as it would take Arnold to really legitimize that. And even then, there's some early studies of bodybuilders by Sterron and guys like that, but it was all looking at the pros, because that's really all there was, and you actually find some kind of interesting stuff back in the archives. But I'd have to do a whole different article about that. It wouldn't be till later into the 2010s and beyond that really studies of bodybuilding, that beyond just physiology of hypertrophy, would start to be done, and that was as bodybuilders started to go into academia, or at least pretend to, when it suited them, and wanted to study their own hobby, and that's. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So basically, lifters just worked by trial and error. They tried different stuff. Most of them, honestly, just got strong in a moderate rep range because Americans liked being strong, and they got bigger. And they would, as they developed new things, like I said, a lot of trial and error. And if you look back at what they were doing pre-1970s, it still works now. Most of that information is just as valid now because human physiology hasn't changed. Now, in the 70s, things changed in a couple ways. One, Arthur Jones came around, and whether or not he was a scientist, because he thought all sports science was bullshit anyway, he at least brought some logic to training. And honestly, I've said this before, if most people would do what was in Knowles Bulletin number 1, they would be better off than doing the cretinous bullshit that is recommended currently. But about that time, that's when drugs really came into the sport. And that really changed things for the worse, simply because drugs make even the dumbest fucking shit work. Pump it up, go heavy, go light, low volume, low intensity, low frequency, high frequency, it didn't matter. And that's when you really started to see the differences in the literature in the bodybuilding magazines, like Flex and Muscle and Fitness, which is weighing the bar doesn't matter, just focus on the squeeze and the pump. And when you throw enough drugs in the mix, none of it matters. Basin showed decades later that a mere 600 milligrams a week built 10 kilos of muscle mass in 20 weeks, which is more than a natural can gain on their first year of training. And 600 milligrams is a baby dose. Guys now are grams per week of anabolics alone, plus insulin, growth hormone, IGF-1, untested peptides, all kinds of ancillaries. If 600 milligrams builds that much muscle, grams build even that much more muscle, and the training is secondary, tertiary, quaternary to just escalating your doses when you stop growing. Duchenne once commented when they attempted to drug test pro bodybuilding and everybody looked like shit, that he realized that just how much drugs were covering up for the mistakes in training and nutrition. Drugs make none of it matter. So the 70s really threw a wrench into it. So somewhere about, for the most part still, science, research was not really used in most of the magazines unless it was to sell supplements, in which case they would be desperately cherry-picked to sell bullshit products to gullible using pro bodybuilders on drugs as the mouthpieces. When I was in college at UCLA from 88 to 93, I would go bother my TA or my professor externally all the time, and he told me about Weider had once cited a study to support a supplement supposedly done at UCLA, and they made it up. It was fabricated. UCLA sued them and won. So that was about the only time that science was really used. The only other exception being when Muscle Media 2000 came on the scene. They were kind of the first ones I really remember that were starting to bring references into the articles, and Duchenne was getting into some of the science, even though he recognized its limitations. As has always been the case, Bill Phillips used science to sell supplements, right? HMB, better than DECA, who remembers that? And the early creatine research and EAS had, some of the early science-based supplements. So I still saw it there, but still by and large, in the magazines, it wasn't used to a great degree, mainly just to sell product. And again, Duchenne, who was always smarter than most in the field, if not one of the smartest people who's ever been around, was starting to utilize it in some of his articles and pay attention to it. And that's when I was getting into it, right? I was an endurance athlete who, even though I was never great at it, loved lifting weights. And I would go bother again Eric Sternlicht every week with my endless questions about this claim and that claim and this, and he started to make me aware that most of the claims were bullshit, and when they were based on science, was cherry picked, and that's when I started spending my weekends in the biomedical library, having to look up on Ovid or just peruse the journals to find what I was looking for, and I decided that rather than believe the claims at face value, I wanted to see what the science actually said, and not shockingly, it wasn't what the articles ever said. Now to about 1992, which is when this little thing called the internet started to become a thing. And this is early days, right? Like I was on AOL first. You had CompuServe. Remember my first little CD-ROM, which gave me 4 free hours on AOL. It was big time. And I mean, shockingly, I'd been a computer nerd from my teenage years, and the internet was kind of cool. Because for good or for bad, it allowed people with common interests to connect, right? So if you were living somewhere and nobody shared your particular interest, whatever it was, and in mine happened to be, training and people that converse intelligently about it, the internet let you connect with those people. And I mean, I still am in contact with people that I met in the mid-90s, which was on an early message board kind of thing called Usenet, just one of the early conversation boards. And that would give way to listservs and then forums and then social media where we're at now. And still at that time, there really wasn't a lot of science, right? Now, fresh out of college and hence knowing everything, now years later, I know a few things, or so I tell myself. I was going to change the field, and everything in Miss Fitness Weights, where I spent most of my time, was the same bro stuff, 20 sets, train like Arnold, 6 meals per day, like all that stuff. And here I came with science, showing that meal frequency didn't stoke the metabolism, that it didn't enhance fat loss or prevent muscle loss or any of that stuff. And I was bringing actual, people go, we don't even know what causes muscle to grow. And I'm like, well, actually, we've known from the 70s that it's progressive tension overload. And all that other nonsense is just drug-fueled gibberish to justify whatever dumb bullshit people wanted to do. And to suffice to say, people were not ready to listen to what I was selling. And typically when they didn't like what I had to say, it was just the standard personal attacks and what do you know and how do you think you're more than Arnold and you're small and I'm bigger than you, and it's just the typical stuff. But for good or for bad, credit me or blame me, the evidence-based fitness industries that exists online I created it. I was the first guy pushing science or attempting to into this field was filled with such a tragic amount of bullshit. That was me. And I've also watched it evolve and then devolve over the last 30 years, but I'll get back to that. So about that time was when websites started to come around. I mean, I had one early from 1996. T-Nation started where T.C. Luoma tried to copy the Bill Phillips model of gain people's trust and then fuck them over with bullshit supplements. And he had the notes, but he didn't have the tune. And they would, occasionally use science to when it suited them to sell product, just like the early magazines had. But it was still mostly bullshit. But that's kind of where it started. And that would continue, into the 1990s. And I forget when I started my first forum, the old, eventually got called Monkey Island. And that's where a lot of science, a lot of people that you probably know of started on my forum. Martin Birkin of Lean Gains, Alan Aragon, Borge Fagerly, and I really apologize if I'm still mispronouncing your name after so many years, Blade. They all started on my forum. And we were exchanging science and arguing and having lots of debates. And I also had a lot of the typical dumb shits who came in and would get mad at me and tell me I fucking sucked and then punk out. Nothing's ever changed. This industry is filled with insecure little babies. As we got into the mid-2000s or so, that's when I remember the shift really starting to occur. Or at least beginning to occur, and that you had people, most of whom had grown up reading my stuff and my books anyway, started to enter the online field. You started to see increases in like online consulting and things of that nature. And I couldn't tell you exactly when all these different folks came in. Like I know Brad Schoenfeld published his first review paper in 2010. So it was all kind of in that range. Now, it was still a niche. I mean, make no mistake. Like, the reality is a site like bodybuilding.com or T-Nation, they get more hits in a day than I would probably get in a year because the average person entering the industry, your typical teenage male or early 20s, that's where they go. I mean, for right or for wrong, that's just the reality of it. But that was never my target audience. Like I knew I wasn't, I wanted to help people that wanted to listen and who cared about science. And if not, cool. That was kind of where we were at. But even still then, there was a large proportion of folks still generating endless bullshit, right? There was the whole circle jerk in the late 2000s of like Alan Cosgrove and Jimmy Smith and Jimmy Moore, and there was a whole bunch of Jimmys, and they had jumped on the Ryan Lee thing, and it was all about marketing and your email list and just a big old circle jerk, and they would use science when it suited them to crank out bullshit products like Afterburn, or in Alan's case, he would just flat out plagiarize my book and then fucking lie about it, as his little cretinous defenders would be like, well, I'll suck, so it's okay if he was plagiarized, shit like that, because this industry is filled with morons. And they didn't like me, shockingly, because I would point out that, well, actually the science you're citing doesn't say what you say it says, and then it would be just the same old bullshit. You suck, you're lame, fuck you, blah, 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 blocked, and then they would go make more money in a month with an email blast than I've probably made in my entire career. But neither here nor there. The other science-based people entered the industry, that's about the time that the term Broscience was coined. And it was meant to be insulting. It was meant to be denigrating to people, and it basically referred to all of the empirically, anecdotally derived ideas from the past 7 decades in the field in terms of training, in terms of frequency, in terms of eating, in terms of all of that. Basically, the scientific people, and make no mistake, I'm sure I was part of this. I'm not pretending that I wasn't, part of the problem. We're like, well, they were taking the white ivory tower approach of, well, we have real science and you just have bro science. But I'll point out again that ignoring the drug-fueled stuff, it's a little hard to dismiss, 7 decades of trial and error that had been shown to work to at least one degree. I mean, now make no mistake, sometimes things work in spite of themselves, right? What had happened with Broscience was things that had been shown to work were then assumed to be the way you had to do it, like the meal frequency thing. Bodybuilders had always prepped. and got into stage eating 6 meals per day. Ergo, that was the way to do it. And it's not so much that that way doesn't work, except when it doesn't and people crash and end up with eating disorders and don't make it to stage. It's that it wasn't necessary, which is what the science on meal frequencies was showing. I'd point out 2004 is when I published my book, A Guide to Flexible Dieting. And once again, I was the first guy to at least discuss that formally with that terminology, coming out of the nutritional science, showing that rigid eating attitudes and rigid eating dieting tended to be more detrimental than beneficial. And of course, nobody was ready to listen. It would be a decade plus before people would realize, as usual, that I was right all along. And then they would steal my ideas, flat out plagiarize me, and never give me credit, because that is the nature of things. So the Broscience thing was still like, well, this is what's always worked. And there's truth to that. And I'm not dismissing it. Again, ignoring the drug-fueled stuff. Naturals, even during that time, or pre-drug use, they clearly figured out some things that work. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily was the only way to do it. Simply, nobody had tried it. Nobody had tried getting to contest shape being more flexible. And when people did, it worked just as well. No one had ever tried a 4 meal per day meal frequency. But when they did, it worked just as well. So in some cases, make no mistake, the science absolutely, when controlled research was done, it would support what the bros had figured out. The Broscience was right. Aha, you say, just listen to Broscience. The thing is, as often as not, it didn't. Like the meal frequency thing, like the rigid dieting thing. There's lots of other examples that I can't think of at the moment because I'm old. So it wasn't so much, it was, like I said, we still needed to do controlled science. Because sometimes the science agreed, and sometimes it didn't. And if you're coming from a scientific basis, that's still the focus. Note, because it's relevant, during this whole time, the basic argument from the bros, if they didn't like the science, came down to, well, I'm bigger and stronger than you, ergo you're wrong. I mean, seriously, that was the bro defense. Or, Lee Haney's bigger than you, Dorian Yates is bigger than you, your science doesn't matter. Again, ignored in that was the drugs, but that was the personal attack. Well, I'm bigger than you, ergo your science is wrong, which is a joke, but at least, as you'll see, it's consistent. But that's what the bros did. The bros believed in Broscience, or in anecdotal, what they thought worked. And that was perfectly fine. And they would just fall back on personal attacks when they didn't like what you had to say. But the evidence-based industry, at least for a while, cared about the science. And then it started to change. So we jump forward to 2014. At this point, more people had entered the industry, a lot of the names that are still around, including Layne Norton. Now, he had established his identity as being the anti-guru. He had a PhD, and he brought science to bring down the gurus, which meant that he would attack these people. And I'm talking about, Gary Taubes, all the nutritional gurus. This industry has never hurt for them because, it's the nature of the field. And he would bring science to the table. And if they tried to use guru arguments and anecdotes and attacks, he would excoriate them because that's not how you make an argument. That's what gurus do. And then in 2014, he brought up the idea of metabolic damage and reverse dieting. And his argument came down to, with hardcore dieting, you can experience metabolic damage that will prevent fat loss despite being on low calories or even create fat gain. That was right about 2014. And I criticized that, as you might imagine. Now, I didn't do it well in terms of the language and the approach that I used, and I'm willing to admit that, because men admit that they're wrong, and nobody else in the industry will do, because they're little babies. And, realize I'd read every paper on metabolic adaptation. 5 decades of work had never shown this. Ever. Because it's not physiologically possible. But Layne had something to sell. And every response that he made was total guru bullshit. He attacked me personally. He said, I don't even do science. He said, I don't have a PhD. He pulled up an old picture of me and he goes, oh, Lyle is small. He doesn't know anything. He said, I have hundreds of emails from competitors saying this happened. That's anecdotal evidence. Then, like all the rest, he would block me on Facebook. He started deleting comments on Twitter and blocking anyone who brought up evidence either that he was wrong or who defended me. The same thing all the gurus that he criticized did, because he had something to sell. And the bottom line is that he was the anti-guru until it was time for him to be the guru himself. He would have excoriated anyone else who made those arguments. But he's a narcissist, which means he's a hypocrite, which means he projects what he does onto everyone else. It was okay for him. And the reality was that there was no metabolic damage. People were misreporting their calories. They were eating more than they thought. Period. That's all it was. And even when he said, oh, when I raised their calories, they started losing fat again. Right, because what had happened is they thought they were eating 800 calories and they were eating 1,800 because it was unmeasured. And when they started tracking, they were really eating 1,400 calories and they were actually in a fucking deficit. There was no metabolic increase to this reverse dieting bullshit, which is still out there. They simply went from underestimating their calories to tracking properly. Or when you raise calories acutely, they stopped retaining water like the crazies that they were. Because what you would see when they raised their calories a bit is that they would lose like 3 to 4 pounds overnight. And there is no physiologically metabolic way for that to possibly occur. It's water retention. It always has been. It always will be. And one of Layne's awesome deflections was, well, metabolic damage was only a theory. Mind you, a theory he presented in endless seminars to buy himself a fucking mansion. But Lyle's water retention is only a theory too. Au contraire. The Minnesota semi-starvation study back in the 50s had shown what they called starvation edema in response to long-term caloric restriction. Water retention was well known. And some random paper that I found that I unfortunately can't source was talking about when they increased their calories after the study was over, stating, for some, the rehabilitation period proved the most difficult part of the experiment. Many were surprised when they initially lost additional weight after being provided a bit more food, a result of losing the excess edema fluid in their bodies. So the data absolutely supported what I was saying. It was no theory, it was well known. Whereas decades of work on metabolic adaptation showed that his claims about metabolic damage were absolutely wrong. As is so often the case, flat out the science said I was right, and flat out the science said he was wrong. And as is so often the case to people like Layne, the science only matters until it's wrong, or until he has something to sell. The simple fact was that people were either underestimating their calories or holding on to water. And hilariously, on Layne's Instagram, if he doesn't have you blocked like he does anyone that criticizes it, he'll prattle about, the reason you're really not losing fat is because you're underestimating your calories. Exactly what I said in 2014. But since he had a mansion to buy, and subsequently a pregnant wife to cheat on, he had to guru out and play the same bullshit games that he would have cried like a baby about had anyone else done it to one of his arguments. And go watch him online and you'll see it. And make no mistake, Layne was not the first one to pull this bullshit. There were plenty of gurus before him, that, like Gary Taubes, who had all these references in his research for 5 years book, who would then dismiss any science he didn't like because he had book sales to make. But Layne was the first one in the supposed evidence-based community, the anti-guru, who only believed in science till it didn't support him. And then he played all the guru games, as all the rest of them, that he would bitch about anybody else using. But I'm going to set the date of the real change at 2018, which is the first time I became aware of it. That's when Brad's volume study came out, that I was, shall we say, highly critical of. And then in hindsight, everybody realized it was right. I mean, even the people that defended it the most vocally, Brad, Eric, James, Brett, all those people, they didn't even believe it. I did a video last year showing how they've all walked back their volume recommendations to what I was saying the entire time. Or look at the video I did a couple weeks ago, pointing out that the results Brad got are impossible, double what every other study has ever found. And like I said, most can look back and go, yeah, Lyle was right all along. It is exhausting. Where I became aware of the real bullshit was when Mike Israetel wanted to debate me about the volume issue. And in a 90-minute completely fucking waste of time, I got the first half, and I spent 45 minutes directly answering every question, addressing every issue in detail. In the second half, Mike spent 45 minutes talking in circles, saying nothing concrete like he always does. Go listen to any 3 different podcasts or debates with him. He will say completely opposite things based on what he needs to say at that moment to be right, because that's what narcissists do. He'll say in one breath, don't just look at the biggest guy in the gym. Go to the science. And then when I bring up the science, he'll go, you should only trust people based on whether or not they're big. But during that debate, he introduced an idea that I had not seen because I don't listen to those people. I read research. I don't care what the talking heads have to say. And he introduced the new pyramid of evidence. So at some point, the evidence-based crew had decided that evidence included direct research, anecdotes, and what they referred to as physiological rationale, which means that, well, we think that there's a physiological rationale for what we're going to argue is true. Now, this is truly fucking beautiful because it basically is a legitimization of goalpost shifting. And others have done this too. Mel Siff, who, rest in peace, was famous for this. If you brought up an anecdote, he would go, well, the science says. And if you brought up science, he'd say, well, anecdotally. Because that way he could always be right, because he would do what's called shifting the goalposts, another logical fallacy. And that's what this pyramid is. Science is the key. But if science doesn't agree with them, or which is what usually happens when I bring up what the research actually says, well, anecdotally, they just shift the goalpost. And if the anecdotes don't, then if I bring up an anecdote, or someone else brings up, well, anecdotally, they'll dismiss that and go, well, the physiological rationale is different. It's beautiful because it allows them to never be wrong because they can just move the argument around. And if you bring up anecdotes, they'll bring up science or physiological rationale. If you bring up physiological rationale, they'll bring up the direct science. It's beautiful, by which I mean what it really is total fucking bullshit. Like I said, it's a way to never be wrong because you can just move your argument around the pyramid in response to any argument that anyone else makes that you don't like. It's the new pyramid of goal-shifting bullshit. Period. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that anecdotes are fundamentally useless, but single anecdotes absolutely are. So one of the best rebuttals to my criticisms of Brad's volume study was James Krieger, who put a picture of a guy on his website saying, well, I trained this guy with high volume, and he's big. I mean, it's even hard for me to address that. It's so lame. But does that mean that if I bring another anecdote that's contradictory, like people I've trained with low volumes that were as bigger than that guy, does my anecdote cancel his out? Does it outweigh his? I mean, hopefully you see the point. An individual anecdote doesn't make any difference, especially now with training that we know that there's hyper responders. Some people will grow on anything you do. One individual doesn't mean anything, right? If you have trained 100 people in a certain way and most of them have gotten results, I may be willing to listen, right? I did a podcast with Alex Kickel, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, a bunch of years ago, and he had like 100 people he was working with. And he put them on anabolics, and he put half on estradiol and half not to see what happened. Now, were his results anecdotal? Yes. Were they published? No. But at least it was 100 people, and that means way more than James's little individual example. Now, again, I'm not saying that anecdotal evidence is useless. Like 7 decades worth of anecdotal training experience, even ignoring the drug issue. You can't just ignore that. However, but at the same time, anecdotes do not counter direct science. The reason James dredged that up is to dismiss my valid criticisms of Brad's study. Because even if we accept that anecdotes have their place, controlled science should always take precedence. And that's the game these people are playing, is that when the science doesn't agree with them, they fall back on anecdotes. Does that make sense? If there's no science, your anecdotes may be considered as a starting point, and maybe they drive what scientists examine, which frequently happens. But if there is direct science, and there was, about the volume thing, where most of the studies countered Brad's evidence, and my criticisms were totally valid, even if Brad was too weak-minded to address them, an anecdote cannot counter that, ever, unless you're playing guru games. And that's why they do it. Another comment about the anecdote thing. I did a long-ass video on this a few years ago, and it's whatever. It's pointless and tedious even by my standards, and I can do it in like 30 seconds. For decades, the evidence-based fitness crew didn't accept anecdotes until they did. But even beyond that, they only accept their anecdotes. And that's the key. Their anecdotes have validity, whereas Gary Taubes' anecdotes, and I'm saying they're right, those are wrong. Layne's hundreds of emails are valid, but anyone else's anecdotes are somehow wrong. If they're going to argue that anecdotes are now counted as scientific evidence, they have to accept all of them, but they don't. Their anecdotes are evidence. Everyone else's anecdotes can be dismissed by, well, there's direct research, or by the whole physiological rationale thing. And that's just hypocritical as shit. And they know it, and everyone listening to this knows it. If you're going to accept anecdotes, you have to accept them all. If you're going to dismiss all anecdotes, you have to dismiss them all. You don't get to like yours and ignore everybody else's. That's bullshit, right? Anecdotes have their place, but they can and never should be used to counter direct controlled science. So far as the whole physiological rationale thing, like I don't disagree with that fundamentally, right? Like if all we have is some basic concepts, but there's like no direct human data or no direct training data, or like yeah, we can maybe make some assumptions about that sometime, but only if there is no direct science, right? Because what usually is done is like the physiological rationale is back argued. These guys decide what their conclusion is and then make up the physiological rationale to support it. Right, because there are cases like we have some data, and I mean animal data is mostly shit and never translates over anyway, but it's like, all right, we know that physiologically this is going on, but we haven't really examined this in terms of whole body or long term, and you make some assumptions, but then you do the science, and if the science agrees, great. If the science doesn't, it doesn't. I mean, here's a good example tying into the protein video I did last week. Right, in my protein book, there was an idea called the muscle full situation, and they would fuse amino acids and find that skeletal muscle would stop responding to amino acids. And this kind of was a physiological rationale to support eating somewhat infrequently. Well, that's clearly wrong. At the time, that's what the data was, and that's why I presented it in my book, but now it's clearly wrong, as that feeding protein paper by little John Tromblin et al. Showed. So if there's no direct science, physiological rationale may be a base, and again, it may often leads to the direct data. But it should never be used either to replace direct data or as a fallback when the science that you don't like doesn't agree with you. And that's the problem I have with it. Again, is this triangle of goal-shifting bullshit is being used to play guru games. It's science until they don't like the science, and then it's anecdotes, except it's only their anecdotes, and then it's physiological rationale when neither anecdotes or the direct science will support whatever they're fucking selling. I will occasionally mention, oh, anecdotally I've seen this, but I'll always pronounce this, it's just an anecdote, don't read anything to it, doesn't matter. I will speculate based on physiological rationale, and I'm usually right, but not always. And if data comes out that supports it, cool. And if it says I'm wrong, then I was wrong, and that's fine. But direct science will always, always outweigh the other two. Always. And that's not how the triangle of goal-shifting bullshit is being used by these people. They're using it as a fallback to move around the triangle whenever the science or the anecdotes, the physiological rationale disagrees with them. And that's bullshit. One more concept, and then I'll wrap. All of that I just talked about, that's under the best of circumstances. Because when really pushed, a lot of these supposed evidence-based people will go full bro. right? Go back and look. When I criticized Mike Israetel for misrepresenting what zero reps in reserve were, go look at his rebuttals to me. Fuck you, Lyle, which is oh so cogent. You should only take advice based on how big someone is. Typical bullshit. Others attack me personally. Others bring up the fact that I've been very open about being bipolar too because they're fucking douchebags. Menno Henselman did that one time. When I brought up legitimate scientific criticism of one of his articles, his immediate response was, "Are you off your meds again?" Because he's a fucking douchebag who needs to eat a dick. Right? When these people are pushed, when the science can't support them, and they don't even have the anecdotes or the physiological rationale, they will go straight to ad hominems. And they'll go full bro. Now let me wrap it. They will go straight to, well, I have a PhD and you don't, as if that makes a shit's worth of difference. Brad Schoenfeld got his PhD from an online university that required 20 hours of on-campus time in 4 years. His master's came from a UT Austin satellite school that's big claim to fame is being one of the best online universities in the South. Your PhD doesn't mean jack fucking shit. Wakefield had an MD, and he published that piece on autism and vaccines. Your degree doesn't mean anything. And if you have to bring it up, that just points out how little it means. That's called an appeal to authority. Layne does it. Brad does it. Mike does it when it suits him. I love his current worthless content. Exercise scientist destroys celebrity workout. Never mind that Mark Wahlberg has been leaner and drier than Mike has ever been on stage, but Jesus fucking Christ. Little Milo Wolf in his rebuttal to what's-his-name was like, exercise scientist, bro scientist. This is content in this industry? What a fucking joke. You motherfuckers, if you have to point out that you have a degree and tell people you're smart, you ain't. If you have to tell people you're evidence-based, you ain't. If you're smart, you'll show it by actually providing evidence for your claims or being able to directly rebut criticisms and questions rather than doing what Brad Schoenfeld did when he didn't blind his study, going, you can trust me, which is apparently the highest form of evidence now. If these people are as smart as they want people to believe, why are they never able to directly rebut criticisms, especially from me? Because in every case, they either attack me personally, they fall back on the same guru bullshit, said appeals authority ad hominems talking in circles like Mike Israetel, or they just block me, right? If someone asks me a question about one of my claims, I can provide the reference for it faster than these motherfuckers can hit the block button. And if I can't rebut it or I can't show the science, I have to consider that I'm wrong. I will always answer direct questions directly without the games that all these other assholes play. Now people will go, but Lyle, you block people all the time. And that's true. I do kick people out of my Facebook group. I block people on my wall. And in exactly 100% of cases, it's because they personally attack me or personally attack my trainee. 100% of the time. Or at least 99.9% of the time. If your first response to a disagreement with me is, are you off your meds? You're the fuck out. Attack my trainee, talk whatever it is, you're out. You ask me a legitimate question about my work, I will always provide the reference. Always. They won't do it. Because they can't, and they know they can't. They'll tell you that they're evidence-based. They'll tell you that they're science-based. But when push comes to shove, and the science doesn't support them, they do all the things that they used to criticize. Now, the bros are at least consistent. If they didn't like what you had to say, they would go, well, I'm bigger and leaner and stronger than you are, so your science is bullshit. Now, I think that's a dumb argument, but at least it's a consistent one, because that's what they always said, and that's fine. My issue with the supposed evidence-based practitioners, among the behaviors themselves, is the hypocrisy. Mike Israetel is an exercise scientist destroying Mark Wahlberg until he's a fuck you Lyle, it's a matter of who's bigger. Brad Schoenfeld is evidence-based until you can trust him. Menno Henselman is evidence-based until he attacks me personally. These people are only science-based when it suits them. And as soon as the science doesn't agree with them, they fall back on all the behaviors that they used to criticize in others. The gurus that they used to take down, like anti-guru Layne Norton, they have all become. They all pretend to be scientists when it suits them. But deep down, and when push comes to shove, they're just a bunch of bros. They are the Broscientists now. For the record, I neither read nor respond to comments or questions either on YouTube or on Instagram because I don't care. But I don't delete them either like the rest of the industry will do. Test it. Go put a critical comment or question on Brad's wall and he'll block you and delete it immediately. I simply don't care. If you want to tell me I'm full of shit and I suck, great. If you want to tell me that I'm awesome and you want to have my children, fan-fucking-tastic. If you ask me a question in the comments, great. I'll never see it. Now, I may try doing a weekly Q&A, and if you want to send me a question, you can send it to questions@bodyrecomposition.com, and there's exactly a 0% guarantee that I will answer it. But you might get lucky. See you next time.